Hi YouTube, and welcome to my presentation. Today I'm just going to be talking to you about a bit about my future project called Modeling the Relationship Between Social Media and Social Consequences. Does the way we interact online affect how we interact in person? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the context is, why I'm doing this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'll be doing, how I'll be doing it, and what the expected outcomes are of my doing so. To talk about my research aims and questions, I first need to discuss the context which brought about these aims and questions. My particular topic of interest is social media. Over the last 20 or so years, social media has become more and more widespread in the lives of everyone around us. It's expanded to the point where the vast majority of citizens in developed nations make use of it, and not only do more people use social media, but people spend more time on it, more times per day, and they're doing it in longer periods of time. Furthermore, since the advent of COVID-19 lockdowns, people are being driven to use social media more often and more intensely as a way to compensate for a lack of experience in the real world. And while just having people do something is curious, it certainly warrants curiosity, the myriad of effects on development, both positive and negative, warrant careful consideration by clinicians and researchers. Problematic social media use can result in addiction, a variety of mood disorders, and the compromise of one's identity, social, romantic, and political development. This is especially true for teens and young adults, who, because of their stage in development and increased use of social media, find themselves at greater risk of experiencing negative consequences associated with social media use. However, our knowledge in this area is vitally hampered by the prevalent use of social media screen hours as a measure, which lacks specificity and clinical utility. We have a wealth of research into whether more or less social media as an aggregate can cause ill effects, but that only tells us that social media use in general can cause these effects. When it comes to which specific activities and ways of engaging with social media cause these effects, we know comparatively less. There is thus a research gap in the area of investigating the ways in which different types of social media use can be manipulated to maximize positive outcomes. This can be expressed in three vital research needs. Future research into this area will need to make use of measures with more specificity and clinical utility. Future research will need to analyze the effects of different patterns of social media use. And future research will need to examine how these different modes of social media use evolve and affect well-being over time. My project aims to fulfill these needs by investigating the ways in which social network site, or SNS, engagement in particular differs across the population, and how SNS engagement evolves over time. SNS engagement being our more specific measure representing the ways in which people use social media. Furthermore, for the purposes of clinical utility, my project also aims to determine how SNS engagement interacts with social engagement and with social media addiction. With social engagement referring to how we interact with people in the real world, whether we are employed, whether we have friends, whether we spend time with them, whether we spend time with our family, how we do that, what do we do that, what do we do when we're with family. That's social engagement. Now, these two interactions are chosen for this study as they both have been found in prior research to interact with social media use in complex ways and have serious consequences for life outcomes and socialization. The study will fulfill these aims by answering the following research questions. How many distinct profiles of SNS engagement are there? What are the proportions and characteristics of any identified SNS engagement profiles. How do the characteristics of any identified SNS engagement profiles change over time? In what ways do social engagement and social media addiction interact with any identified SNS engagement profiles over time? To answer these questions, I will be testing roughly 1,000 high school and undergraduate students from the age of 13 to 29, roughly split down the middle. This demographic was chosen for twofold reasons. Firstly, because members of this age group are most at risk of problematic social media use, both because of their stage of development and because of the intensity of their use. Secondly, because high school, college students are more likely to have the technical skills associated with problematic social media use. Now, these participants will be gathered via a number of physical advertisements being placed around campuses, as well as targeted emails to applicable students to ensure that students who are familiar with social media are recruited. Now, should a potential participant call an indicated number, they will be booked a meeting where we'll inform them about the purpose of the study, the requirements of their rights to confidentiality and withdrawal at any time, and if informed consent is given, then the testing can begin. Testing consists of a number of Qualitrix links sent out every 6 months for roughly 2 years. Participants will have 1 week in which to complete the survey, and in this time participants can proceed at their own pace, taking some of the pressure off and increasing participant retention. It also allows us a period of time in which to book any follow-up meetings should they be necessary. So 1 week's a pretty good time span, week 4 at least. Now, during that time span, for my test in particular, 3 tests are administered. The Social Media Use Integration Scale, or SMUS, the Bergen Social Media Addiction Scale, and the PROMIS Social Participation Scale. These each measure, in turn, SNS engagement, social media addiction, and social engagement. And I chose them for their good psychometric properties as well as their ability to target key concepts important to the study in the least amount of time possible. Once 2 years have passed and all participant data has been gathered, it should be collated into a single file for analysis, which I'm about to talk about in more detail, and then hopefully published, fingers crossed, if everything goes well. Now, going further into this data analysis, I'll be conducting the data analysis for my project in 2 distinct steps. Now, the first is a growth mixture model. This method was chosen for its ability to identify distinct homogeneous subgroups in the sample and map out their development over time as measured on some continuous dependent variable, in this case SNS engagement. Furthermore, it can map these relationships in a nonlinear fashion, which makes it superior to more traditional modeling techniques such as ANOVA. Now here I've modeled 3 distinct subgroups. Now each subgroup will have its own characteristics identified by the model and described in some way that matches those characteristics. In this case, I've described my profiles and called them the increasingly dominated users, the consistently moderate users, and the declining interest users. So those are just examples of names, and I'll probably be using much more kind of exacting and clinical terminology when I name the real groups in the analysis stage. Now the second step is a pair of factorial ANOVA tests with time and class making up the independent variables, and social media addiction or social engagement making up the dependent variables. These will map out linear relationships over time, identifying how these well-being related variables varied over time for each SNS engagement profile. This will allow me to map development on SNS engagement and on these well-being related factors, and then compare those maps against each other for each identified SNS engagement profile. But what effects will this have? Well, practical effects, we expect there to be about three major ones. Firstly, it allows for the profiling of social media use and the identification of problematic social media use patterns. This allows clinicians more tools when identifying potential social media related issues in clients, as well as allowing for tailor-made interventions targeting problems unique to certain social media use patterns. Flowing on from this benefit is the identification of social effects of social media. By tying specific effects on social media to specific social network site engagement profiles, we can find specific social risk factors and then better address them in tailored interventions. Lastly, this study will result in the identification of which social media engagement profiles are at risk of social media addiction and which social engagement behaviors may be protective against addiction. This again allows more resources to clinicians with tailored interventions, and it allows for a quicker identification of which clients might be at risk of social media addiction. Furthermore, it is expected to contribute to the field of psychology in three important ways. Firstly, and most importantly, this study would innovatively map out distinct SNS engagement profiles and do that for different users and map them out over time to see how people engage with social media and how these ways of engaging evolve over time. By showing that there are distinct profiles of SNS engagement, it prompts further research into this topic and serves as a springboard for future research into SNS engagement variation. Secondly, this project will innovatively compare SNS engagement with social engagement, exploring the relationship between interacting with people online and one's ability to interact with people in the real world. If a relationship is found, then this will serve as a signpost for future research into the peculiarities of this relationship and how to manipulate it. Thirdly, the study's longitudinal nature allows for the drawing of conclusions about how SNS engagement affects both social engagement and social media addiction. Now, thank you all for listening to me. I know it's been a long one. Before I leave you all tonight, I thought I'd just thank some people. I'd like to thank my mentors and supervisors, Vasilios Stavropoulos, Rapson Gomez, and Joe Doyley, for all their help and patience with me. I'd like to thank my family and my very tolerant partner who've been putting up with me isolating myself from them to get all this work done. And I'd like to thank you guys, the audience, for listening to me babble. Thank you for listening. And just in case you can, here are some references which you can use to check out what I'm saying. Thank you and goodbye.